Why would Rome risk a silent march through enemy territory? It was the kind of decision that could make a commander immortal or infamous. In the dead of night, far from the safety of stone walls or fortified camp, a Roman legion was on the move. No horns, no shouted orders, just the soft thud of hobnailed sandals on packed earth, the occasional jingle of chainmail instantly muffled by a gloved hand. Every soldier knew the stakes. If the enemy discovered them before dawn, there would be no retreat. They would be crushed between the night's darkness and the enemy's daylight fury. Legionaries, before the march continues, subscribe to our channel, stand with Rome, and witness history's greatest battles. Prepare yourself. We begin. The year was 178 BCE, deep in the campaign season of the northern frontier. Rome's legions had been stalled for weeks, hemmed in by a numerically superior foe who had chosen his ground well, a network of ridges and valleys perfect for defense, with supply lines running back into rugged hill country. Every daylight probe had been repulsed. The army's morale was sagging. Grain was running low. Rome's commander, a man whose career had been built on calculated risks, knew that time was no longer on his side. The enemy, certain of their advantage, had begun to relax their vigilance. Scouts withdrew earlier in the evening, watch rotations grew lazy, and fires burned high and bright in the camp after sunset. To the commander's eye, this was not just overconfidence, it was opportunity. The Roman Senate had been sending pointed messages. Resources were needed elsewhere, victories had to be won quickly. A drawn-out siege was politically unacceptable. The commander's own rivals back in Rome were sharpening their knives for a public humiliation if he failed. A direct attack would have been suicide. But what if he could reposition his entire force overnight, crossing treacherous ground to strike from a direction the enemy considered impassable? What if dawn broke, not on a standoff, but on the shock of a Roman cohort pouring through their rear defenses? In daylight, such a maneuver would have been seen miles away. At night, it would be unseen, but it would also be unseen to his own men, whose ability to keep formation, maintain direction, and avoid panic would be tested to the limit. Roman doctrine prized discipline, but marching in darkness over uncertain terrain, with the enemy close enough to hear a careless cough, this was almost never attempted. Ancient historians such as Livy and Polybius describe these rare night operations with a mix of awe and trepidation. Archaeological surveys of Roman military roads show subtle deviations and cut paths that suggest carefully scouted single-use night routes, evidence of operations that left no official record but lived on in the stories of the soldiers who survived them. Along one suspected route north of the Po River, worn cobbles vanish into a stretch of beaten earth still traceable today, flanked by the remains of watchtowers, perhaps abandoned in haste. For the men of this legion, every step in the dark was a step deeper into uncertainty. They could not light torches, the glow would give them away. Orders were passed by hand signals and the quiet touch of a centurion's vine staff. Shields were strapped tighter to avoid rattling. Even the mules' hooves were wrapped in leather to dampen sound. Somewhere out in the darkness, perhaps only a few hundred paces away, enemy pickets stood at their posts. One false step, one clatter of metal, and the night would erupt in alarm. The legion would be caught mid-stride, unformed, vulnerable. The commander had gambled everything, his career, his men, his city, on the hope that his army could pass like a shadow and strike like a thunderbolt. In his place, would you have done the same? The Romans were masters of organized violence, but they did not often choose to move their armies in darkness. For most commanders, night was an ally of confusion, not victory. In darkness, a soldier could stumble into a ravine, lose formation, or mistake a comrade for an enemy. Worse still, a frightened man could spread panic through a column faster than any enemy charge. Yet when Rome did commit to a night march, it was the product of a machine so disciplined, so ruthlessly precise, that even the inherent chaos of the dark could be bent to its will. The legion was not a mob of fighters, it was a moving organism, 6,000 men, divided into cohorts and centuries, each with a clearly defined place in the formation. Every legionary knew the exact spacing between himself and the man ahead. Every centurion knew the position of his unit in the column without needing to see it. This was drilled relentlessly, day after day, on training grounds from Hispania to Syria. Soldiers learned to navigate by sound, keeping formation to the rhythm of boots on earth or the steady creak of a cartwheel. Roman training manuals, fragments of which survive in later military writers like Vegetius, stress that a silent army is a disciplined army. Silence was not simply a matter of keeping quiet, it was a tactical weapon. Orders were conveyed through hand signals, taps on the shoulder, or the controlled use of horns that could be heard but not easily located in the dark. In some cases, officers carried small covered lamps, shielded on three sides, their light visible only to those directly behind. But training alone could not make a night march possible. Logistics, the lifeblood of any Roman campaign, had to adapt. Wagons with iron-shod wheels were left behind, or muffled with leather wrappings to avoid the telltale clank. Supply loads were redistributed so that pack animals made less noise, their equipment wrapped in cloth. Even the soldiers' own gear was adjusted, metal fittings padded, shields cinched tighter against their backs to prevent the slap of wood on armor. The Romans also exploited one of their most underrated advantages, their road system. Even deep in enemy territory, military surveyors and engineers would prepare routes in advance. These were not always the grand, stone-paved highways of Italy. More often they were dirt or gravel tracks cleared of obstacles and graded for speed. In the case of a night march, advance parties of engineers could move silently ahead to check footing, mark hazards, and ensure that when the main column arrived, it could pass without hesitation. This preparation did more than keep the column moving. It struck at the psychology of the enemy. Few things demoralized an opponent more than realizing that the Romans had appeared where they could not possibly be. Historical accounts from the wars in Hispania and the Danube tell of tribal forces waking to find Romans not in front of their defenses, but behind them, cutting off escape or seizing key high ground. In some cases, the enemy broke and fled without a fight, unable to comprehend how an army had moved so far, so fast, unseen. And yet, secrecy was fragile. One loose tongue in a tavern, one intercepted dispatch, one scout who caught the gleam of moonlight on a helmet, and the advantage would be lost. To guard against this, the Romans employed deception measures. Decoy fires were left burning in the old camp, manned by a skeleton guard to give the impression of a stationary army. Scouts rode in wide arcs to intercept any locals who might stumble upon the column and carry word to the enemy. Even within the army, details of the route and objective were restricted to senior officers. The common soldier often marched without knowing exactly where he was headed until the moment of attack. Foreshadowed in these methods was the strength that would make this particular night march possible. A perfect blend of discipline, infrastructure, and calculated misdirection. The legion's cohesion under pressure, its ability to maintain order in darkness, was not the product of chance. It was the outcome of decades of refinement in Rome's way of war. Still, the challenge ahead was unprecedented. No amount of training could eliminate the risks entirely. As the commander prepared his men for the silent march, he knew that even the best machine could be undone by the smallest fault, and on that night there would be no margin for error. Night had fully claimed the valley when the order came. No trumpet, no formal announcement, just the quiet movement of centurions through the ranks, touching shoulders, whispering to their optios, who in turn passed the signal down the line. The legion was to move, now. The terrain was treacherous by day and worse by night. The enemy camp lay beyond a winding ridge that funneled into a narrow pass, flanked by broken ground and thorn-choked gullies. In daylight, enemy sentries would have spotted movement miles away. At night, the same ground could be crossed unseen, but at the cost of footing, orientation, and speed. The moon was little more than a silver sliver, offering scant light, a blessing for concealment, a curse for navigation. Intelligence had been gathered for weeks. Roman scouts, exploratores, had slipped into the hills under guise of hunters and traders, mapping the folds of the land, counting the pace between boulders and streams. They had charted two possible routes. One was safer but longer, the other shorter, but passing within bowshot of an enemy outpost. The commander chose the shorter. Speed was everything. The longer they marched, the greater the risk of a stray noise, a snapped branch, a glint of bronze catching starlight. The decision was the point of no return. Once the column left the safety of camp, there would be no halting until they reached the chosen ground by dawn. A half-march would mean disaster, caught in mid-movement by an enemy army that would attack from a position of strength, Formation was critical. At the very front moved the speculatores, hand-picked scouts with orders to neutralize any sentry they encountered without sound. Behind them, the vanguard cohort advanced in staggered pairs, each man's pace matched to the one before. The main body followed in compressed order, cohorts 3 abreast, where the ground allowed, narrowing to single file through bottlenecks. The baggage train, stripped to essentials, brought up the rear with a small rear guard to catch any straggler who might wander off the line. Every measure to reduce sound had been enacted. Armor wrapped in wool, weapon hilts bound in leather. Even the bronze fittings on helmets were dulled with soot. Mules and horses wore padded hooves. When the column forded a shallow stream, men removed their sandals and waded silently, holding them in their teeth. The cold bite of water in the night air was a shock, but no one complained. Then came the first tension spike. A scout returned at a crouch, breath hard, reporting enemy pickets closer than expected. The outpost on the ridge, thought to be empty, was manned. They would have to pass within a stone's throw. Orders went down the line, no talking, no coughing, eyes forward. The column slowed, stretching time to a crawl. The speculatores vanished into the dark ahead. Moments later, they returned, no words exchanged, just a subtle wave onward. Whether they had eliminated the sentries or simply passed unseen, no one knew. The line moved forward, hearts pounding. The night grew colder, mist rising from the low ground. The moisture slicked stones underfoot, making the march a test of balance as much as endurance. Men fought the urge to glance upward, to search for the first hint of light. Dawn would be the signal for action, or for ruin if they were caught in the open. Midway through the march, a second danger emerged. From the hills came the distant bark of dogs. The column froze, even muffled. Hundreds of soldiers halting in unison make a sound, a faint, rhythmic hush of motion ceasing. The commander's aides strained their ears. No shouts followed. The dogs barked again, then fell silent. Perhaps they scented a fox. The column resumed, each man aware that fortune had just spared them. Hours passed. The pace was relentless. In darkness, fatigue feels heavier. Distances stretch. Without landmarks, men marched as if in a dream, anchored only by the faint outline of the helmet ahead. Centurions drifted up and down their files, pressing a hand to a man's back to keep him steady, whispering encouragement when a stumble threatened the line. The last leg was the most dangerous. The final descent toward the target took them along a narrow defile, its walls close enough to scrape shields. If the enemy discovered them here, the Legion would have no room to maneuver, trapped like fish in a net. The commander had taken the risk knowingly. The defile emptied onto open ground directly behind the enemy camp. If they emerged unseen, the element of surprise would be absolute. The moment came in near silence. The scouts ahead signaled clear. One by one, the files broke from the defile into the cool pre-dawn air. Above them, the eastern sky was just beginning to pale. Across the shallow valley lay the enemy camp, fires smoldering, sentries yawning at their posts, most of the army still sleeping. The Legion halted. Men adjusted their grips on spears and swords. Cohorts reformed from march column into attack order, shields locking in the front ranks. Horns were drawn from their cases but not yet sounded. This was the pause before the storm. The commander rode forward, surveying the ground. Weeks of frustration, days of planning, and hours of silent marching had brought them here. His choice now was whether to strike immediately, while the enemy was still in disarray, or wait for the light to grow, ensuring his men could see their targets clearly. Either decision carried risk: attack in near darkness, and the enemy might panic, but so might his own troops. Wait, and the enemy might rally before the first blow. He did not hesitate long. A brief signal was given. Horns sounded, sharp and sudden, breaking the silence like a blade through cloth. The Legion surged forward. The night march was over. The battle had begun. Would you have waited for the sun, or trusted the shadows to finish what they'd begun? Rome's wars were not fought only on the field. Every march, every battle, was shadowed by politics. For the commander, who had just risked his entire force on a night march, the real contest had begun long before he left camp. In Rome, the Senate chambers were arenas as dangerous as any battlefield. Senators who had never marched a mile in armor debated strategy with the same ferocity they brought to gladiatorial games. Except here, the stakes were reputations, careers, and the distribution of Rome's ever-expanding wealth. In the weeks before the operation, the commander had received dispatches from his political allies. Some urged caution, better to preserve the army for a more favorable engagement. Others demanded decisive action, fearing that a prolonged stalemate would embolden the enemy and diminish Rome's prestige. Between the lines, every message carried an unspoken truth. If he failed, his rivals would feast on the wreckage of his career. If he succeeded, they would find ways to claim a share of the glory. The Senate was divided into factions, some aligned with his patrician family, others loyal to competing generals whose own commands depended on victory in other theaters. News from the northern frontier had been slow and frustrating. Small skirmishes, no major victories, no clear end in sight. Grain shipments to the city were steady, but there were whispers that if the stalemate continued, merchants might redirect supplies elsewhere. Political pressure hardened into something sharper, an ultimatum: end the campaign quickly or be recalled. Recalling a commander for indecision was no idle threat. Rome had done it before. Defeat in the field was bad, but inaction could be worse. A failure to act boldly was seen as a failure of Roman virtues, the courage and decisiveness expected of a leader. The commander knew the Senate's appetite for boldness. He also knew that the same senators who demanded it would be the first to condemn him if boldness ended in disaster. Among his officers, not all were loyal. Military commands were rich prizes, and promotion often came less from battlefield merit than from political favor. There were men in his council who, if given the chance, would see him stumble, then step into his place. Even in planning the night march, he had kept the circle of full knowledge small, not just to maintain secrecy from the enemy, but to guard against betrayal within. A careless or hostile word sent back to Rome could have killed the plan before the first soldier moved. Personal ambition drove the decision as much as strategy. The commander was not young, and the arc of his career was approaching its peak. One more triumph could secure his legacy alongside Rome's greatest generals. One failure could relegate him to the shadows, remembered only in cautionary tales told to young officers. The night march was a gamble, but also an answer to his rivals. He could act decisively, with precision and nerve. The danger was not limited to the field. If the march failed, the Senate would not view it as a tactical setback. It would be spun as reckless folly, a misuse of Rome's soldiers, perhaps even an affront to the gods for violating the natural order of battle. Political enemies could exploit such accusations to push for his prosecution, stripping him of wealth, honors, and the right to command. In Rome, the law was a weapon, one that could be drawn in victory or defeat. There were also voices in Rome who feared what a stunning victory might mean. A general who became too popular with the legions could become a political threat at home. History was already marked with names of commanders whose loyalty to the Senate waned as their personal power grew. For some senators, it was safer to have a competent but unremarkable commander than a brilliant one with the devotion of thousands of armed men. The march was therefore more than a tactical maneuver. It was a move in a game of power. The commander had to win in such a way that his victory could not easily be claimed by others, but also without appearing so ambitious that he seemed a danger to the Republic itself. This delicate balance meant that even in the midst of planning routes, ration schedules and silent signals, he was calculating how his actions would be read in the Forum and the Curia. In the moments before the march began, as the army's campfires burned low and the first cohorts prepared to move, the commander would have known that his true audience was not the enemy sleeping in their tents, but the men in togas far away in Rome. To them, this was a test, not just of military skill, but of political judgment. A triumph would mean laurel crowns, a procession through the city, his name inscribed on monuments. Failure would mean disgrace, exile, and the slow erasure of his memory from Rome's proud annals. The gamble had been placed. He would meet the dawn not only with the enemy's camp before him, but with the Senate's verdict hanging invisibly over his head. In his place, knowing that one misstep could end a career as surely as a spear through the chest, would you have marched into the dark. The soldiers would remember that night for the rest of their lives, though not all would tell it the same way. Some spoke of it as a trial of endurance, a march that tested every joint and sinew until each step felt like it might be the last. Others recalled a strange calm, the world reduced to the dim shape of the man ahead and the muted rhythm of sandals on earth. For every man, there was the unspoken knowledge that any sound too loud, any misstep too great, could bring the enemy down on them in the dark. Night campaigning was a rare thing in the Roman army, and for good reason. The body's strength ebbs when it is forced from rest into exertion. Eyes strain against shadows, the senses sharpen to the point of exhaustion, and judgment can falter. On a normal day's march, men might talk, share jokes, or complain about rations. But in the dark, conversation was replaced by silence, an enforced quiet that made each man feel both more alone and more part of a whole. They were not individuals now. They were a single, moving entity, bound together by the discipline Rome had drilled into them. For the rank-and-file legionary, the routines of the night march were deliberate and precise. Armor was checked twice before moving out, every strap tightened to keep it from rattling. Pilum and gladius were kept close at hand, the weight familiar. Shields were lashed to the back more snugly than for a day march to avoid the slap of wood on armor. Sandals, already worn thin from weeks of campaigning, were inspected for loose hobnails that might click against stone. Even the small things mattered, eating a last cold bite of bread before departure to avoid hunger pangs that might distract in the darkness. The centurions played a crucial role in keeping the men focused. Each knew his century's pace by heart, adjusting for the slower footing of night. They moved up and down the line, checking formations, correcting gaps with a tap of the vine staff. If a man stumbled, the centurion's hand steadied him before he could fall. No one shouted, but the authority was still there, a presence felt as much as heard. Fatigue was the enemy as much as the opposing army. Hours into the march, legs ached and shoulders burned from the weight of gear. The mind wandered, tempted by thoughts of the next camp, the next chance to rest. Some soldiers recited prayers silently, others fixed their attention on counting steps to distract from the ache. The darkness warped time, moments stretched endlessly, then collapsed into sudden bursts of awareness, like the barking of distant dogs or the hiss of a stream underfoot. When dawn came and the enemy was in sight, the effect on morale was electric. Weariness vanished, replaced by the rush of realization. They had done what seemed impossible. The campfires were still burning, the enemy still oblivious. Men who had dragged themselves forward for hours now felt the surge of readiness, gripping their weapons with renewed strength. The long night had transformed into a weapon. The march itself became part of the victory. In the days that followed, the story spread quickly through the ranks. Around the fires, soldiers retold how they had crept past enemy sentries or crossed the defile unseen. Details blurred in the telling, but the core remained. They had outmaneuvered the foe not by brute force, but by silence, discipline, and endurance. These tales traveled with them to the next campaign and to the taverns and farms of Italy when their service ended. Songs were composed, simple marching tunes that carried the rhythm of boots on earth, each verse a boast about that night. For Rome, these successes reinforced a cultural identity that was as much about cunning as it was about courage. The legionary's life was not only about facing the enemy in open combat, it was about enduring hardship, obeying orders without hesitation, and trusting that the man beside you would do the same. Secrecy, patience, and collective will became as much a part of Rome's martial pride as the glint of steel in the sun. Yet the men also knew that such marches were rare for a reason. Darkness could hide an army, but it could also hide disaster. Every veteran who had made that march carried an understanding that the same night which had delivered victory could, under different stars, have brought annihilation. And in the quiet moments between campaigns, when the fires burned low and the night wind stirred the canvas of their tents, some wondered which fate might claim them the next time the order came to march in darkness. Would you have walked into that night knowing you might never see the morning? The first horn call after the night march was not the thin, cautious note of a signal in transit. It was a full-throated blast, sharp as a blade and twice as cutting in its effect. The enemy camp, still curled in the warmth of sleep, awoke to chaos. Fires that had burned down to embers now flared as startled men stumbled to their feet, shouting in confusion. Some reached for weapons, others for shields, others for the nearest path of escape. None had expected to find the legions already upon them. The Romans struck before the sun fully crested the ridge. Cohorts advanced in tight formation, the front rank of shields forming an unbroken wall, pila held high and ready. Behind them, the second and third ranks stood poised to hurl their javelins in a volley that would break the enemy's cohesion before swords were drawn. The shock was immediate. In the first moments of contact, resistance was scattered, small knots of defenders forming here and there, only to be enveloped or driven back. The commander had chosen his point of attack well. The camp's rear was poorly fortified, a weakness born of complacency and the belief that no enemy could approach unseen from that direction. The Romans poured through this gap like water through a breached dam. As the enemy scrambled to form lines, they found themselves fighting uphill toward their own center, disoriented by the reversal of the battlefield they had prepared. For the legionaries, the fatigue of the night march evaporated in the burst of combat. Adrenaline surged, muscles remembered their work, and the discipline of drill took over. Pila flew in deadly arcs, shields slammed into faces, gladi thrust in short, brutal strokes. Every man understood that the first minutes would decide whether surprise turned into victory or dissolved into chaos. The centurions bellowed orders now, their voices carrying over the clash of steel, formation changes, pushes to exploit weak points, commands to hold fast against counterattacks. The enemy commander, woken by the noise, tried to rally his men. He rode to the thick of the fighting, but the camp's narrow lanes and the press of retreating soldiers slowed him. His orders were drowned in panic. Units that might have formed a coherent defense were cut off before they could join, their banners lost in the smoke and confusion. By the time the sun's first full light spilled across the valley, the Romans held the camp's central ridge, the high ground from which they could drive the enemy in any direction they chose. From the ridge, the commander signaled a push to the supply area. Capturing the enemy's stores would cripple their ability to regroup. The attack here was swift and decisive. Guards overwhelmed, wagons seized, granaries put to the torch. This was more than a battlefield victory. It was the removal of the enemy's capacity to wage war in the near term. To the men, it was proof that the night march had been worth every blister, every aching step. They saw with their own eyes the enemy fleeing in disorder, their camp littered with abandoned weapons and overturned cooking pots. The mood surged with confidence, a tangible wave of pride that could be felt in the set of their shoulders and the steady rhythm of their movements as they secured the ground. Yet for the commander, the work was not done. Victory was only complete if it could be secured without overextension. The temptation to pursue the fleeing enemy into the hills was strong. Every soldier's instinct was to press the advantage, but the commander resisted. He knew that beyond the ridges, the terrain favored the defenders again. The purpose had been to break the enemy's hold on this position, not to be drawn into an ambush on unfamiliar ground. Back in Rome, the news would travel fast. Couriers carried word south along the military roads, each retelling the story with its own embellishments. In the Senate, allies of the commander would use the victory to silence critics, at least for a time. His rivals would be forced to acknowledge the boldness of the maneuver, though they might still grumble about the risks taken. The political calculus had shifted in his favor. Strategically, the victory had far-reaching effects. The enemy, once emboldened by their defensive position, now faced the reality that Roman arms could reach them anywhere, even through the dead of night. Neighboring tribes, watching closely, began to reconsider their alliances. Some sent envoys to Rome offering terms, eager to avoid being the next target of a night-born strike. Others fortified their camps more heavily, but the knowledge that such measures might not be enough gnawed at their confidence. The legion itself gained a new edge in reputation. They were no longer just a disciplined force in daylight battle. They were a shadow in the dark, capable of appearing where they were least expected. This psychological weapon would serve Rome well in campaigns to come, influencing enemy decisions before a single sword was drawn. But there were costs. Men had been lost in the final assault, and others would bear wounds for the rest of their lives. The physical strain of the march, though masked by victory, would take its toll in the following days. Some officers quietly questioned whether the same result could have been achieved with less risk, and in the back of the commander's mind there was the understanding that boldness, once rewarded, was also expected. Rome would not easily accept caution from him in the future. The night march had not only won a battle, it had set a precedent. In the years to come, others would attempt to replicate the feat, sometimes succeeding, sometimes failing disastrously. Darkness was a tool, but like all tools in war, it could cut both ways. For now, though, the army stood victorious in the enemy's camp, the scent of smoke and the glint of captured weapons around them, the first light of morning gilding the helmets of men who had marched through the night to claim the day. If you were the commander, would you press the advantage and chase the enemy into the hills, or hold the ground you had already turned into a prize? Victory in war is rarely the product of a single decision, but sometimes one choice outweighs all others. For the Romans on that campaign, the night march was such a choice. It had been a calculated gamble, one that married discipline, logistics, and sheer nerve into a single, decisive stroke. By trusting in their training and their commander's vision, they had transformed the dangers of darkness into an advantage that the enemy could neither anticipate nor withstand. In the days after, the army's camp buzzed with the telling of the story. Officers discussed the flawless execution of the route, how each cohort had held formation in the dark, how the baggage train had slipped past without a sound. Among the rank and file, the details took on a legendary cast. Enemy sentries who never saw them pass, the eerie stillness before the horn sounded, the look of shock on the foes' faces as the first peeler flew. To the soldiers, it was proof that courage was not only found in the clash of arms, but in the long, silent hours before the first blow was struck. For the commander, the victory was more than tactical. It was political survival. The Senate's doubts were silenced, at least temporarily. Rivals could not easily undermine a man whose name was now spoken alongside Rome's boldest leaders. Yet he knew how quickly fortunes could change. Rome loved audacity when it succeeded. It had no mercy when it failed. His reputation was now bound to the kind of risk few dared to take, and the expectation for future campaigns would be nothing less. The legacy of the march was twofold. Strategically, it reminded enemies that Rome's reach was not confined to the obvious or the conventional. Any stronghold, no matter how secure it seemed, could be turned vulnerable overnight. Culturally, it reinforced the Roman ideal of the disciplined legionary, able to endure hardship without complaint, to act with unity in the most precarious of circumstances, and to strike with precision when the moment came. Modern warfare, for all its technology, still values the same principles. Special operations forces move under cover of darkness for the same reason the Romans did, to seize the initiative, to appear where the enemy is weakest, to turn surprise into dominance. In every era, the advantage lies with those willing to act boldly when others would wait for the safety of daylight. The enduring lesson of that night is clear. Victory often belongs to those who can see in the dark, not with their eyes, but with their judgment. To march in silence through enemy territory, knowing that one slip could spell disaster, requires a kind of confidence that borders on defiance. It is the belief that preparation, discipline, and willpower can outmatch chance and fear. So the question remains, as it did on that night so long ago, in the face of uncertainty, when the safe path means delay and the dangerous path offers the chance for glory, would you wait for the sun or march into the shadows?